Stas, John, thanks so much for joining me here on our panel discussions here and our security sessions. Today, I brought both of you together. I think you both bring great insight and perspective on the idea of compliance, particularly when it comes to security compliance. And I'd love to go through a couple points here, see what you guys think about them, how you guys look at kind of different topics within the compliance realm, and share your knowledge and your experience. So thanks for joining me. John, if you wouldn't mind starting, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing, what you're working on.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. My name's John Elbay, based out of London. Currently work for EY as a senior manager in the technology risk practice. A lot of my experience is working across a range of organizations, looking at information security, compliance audits across what we call system and organization control examinations. So that can be SOC 1 for ICFR and SOC 2 in terms of the sort of contractual provision of services that service organizations give to their customers. So essentially, I audit these service organizations, typically that provide services to a range of customers, and that is aligned to either financial year end, if it's a SOC 1, or aligned to actually the specific customer's review period under examination. That's me in a nutshell. As I say, currently it's busy season, so working across a range of customers to provide financial year end attestation reports.
Very good. Well, I appreciate you making some time for us during your busy season. Very much appreciated. And Stas, maybe a little intro about yourself as well.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stas Bojoukha. I'm the CEO and founder of Compyl. My background is information security. I've had about 20 years of experience in this space. I've got pretty much every certification, and my background is information security compliance in financial services.
Cool. Very good. Well, thank you as well for being here. So I kind of want to start at the beginning. I don't want to leave any room for interpretation here. So let's just start with kind of, compliance in a kind of a look through the lens of security. John, maybe you could kind of start walking us through this. Why are there security frameworks? Why are they important? Where did this kind of come from? Maybe you could start just there.
Yeah, it's a great question in terms of, compliance against what we kind of see as a security framework as such. I'll try to avoid a lot of acronyms, but, from a very sort of foundational level, it's an appreciation of, what assets are most prized for an organization. That could be residing sort of customer held data. It could be intellectual property. It could just be personal data related to the organization as well. So from that perspective, it's understanding that there's a broad principle or an understanding of information security governance and how to make sure it's restricted to the appropriate personnel that need access to that data and the underlying systems that support it. So from that perspective, aligning to security frameworks, there's obviously a lot of sort of different international standards out there, but it's trying to understand from an organization perspective what the level of maturity, what they're trying to get to in terms of achieve their sort of objectives. But it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach, and that's what I was going to say in terms of there's not necessarily one unique standard that you need to comply with, but just an understanding of information security governance and awareness among the sort of the organization, the personnel that are handling data, and what their obligations are to not just the company but to their customers in the context of contractual obligations. So handling client data, what is the categories of sensitive data, and how that neatly defines into a framework. I can touch upon frameworks as such, but Stas, I don't know if you've got any inputs there in terms of what the sort of bedrocks are.
No, I think that that's a pretty good high-level summary of. It's essentially it's a report attesting that an organization is doing what they're supposed to be doing and ensuring that a third party has reviewed it and confirmed it. There are different levels, right? So a SOC 2 and SOC 1 are self-imposed controls. Obviously, they have to be within a certain guideline that have to be met, where other things are more stringent, like the ISO, and regulations like GDPR, CCPA. Those are more, those are mandated. So they have more insight and more stringency around them.
Yeah. No, I think, sorry, Dan, I think from my perspective as well, in terms of frameworks, when I said it's not a one size fits all, it's understanding, okay, how do we get the sort of predominant sort of structure in place? What do we mean? So it should be sort of ground up in terms of policies and procedures in order for people to adhere to. So there needs to be a sort of central vision, which is a top-down approach from management, the board of directors, the stakeholders that are ultimately accountable to their investors and their customer client base. So we do typically see a lot of sort of different frameworks being applied. I don't know if you want me to kind of go into it too much detail, but typically what we see is a lot of sort of reference to COBIT. So that's the Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology. Another acronym is the ITIL framework. That's the Information Technology and Infrastructure Library. We also see, as Stas actually referred to as well, in terms of the ISO series as well, typically 27001. And essentially what we see there is a solid framework for people trying to achieve what would be a internationally recognized level of governance with respect to information security. So there are various different layers, but that's what we typically see in the marketplace in terms of security frameworks. There are various different flavors to it. We've got the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. We've also got High Trust and COSO framework as well. A lot of acronyms there, but to try and get the security framework in place, it's important that people understand, okay, what's my objectives? How's that aligned? And what's the sort of profile of the organization as well? Are we limited to a domestic audience? Do we actually have any third-party dependencies? Where does our data reside? A lot of companies have traditional data centers which host their information, or they potentially have their data that resides in the cloud. So that could be a whole range of different sort of, it could be Google Cloud, it could be AWS, Azure. How do we make sure that our information is locked down? What are our obligations in the context of that as well? And that is all drawn out of comparison to a security framework and mapping out the boundaries of the responsibility in terms of the organization that handles the data, but also in terms of what we would call those vendors, those third-party dependencies, and what their obligations are, and how do we actually have a continuous monitoring process and improvement plan to track against that. That's what we typically see from a security framework standpoint.
Thank you, man. Pretty thorough.
That was very thorough.
Well, John, I think one of the things I wanted to kind of gain some knowledge from your perspective here was, organizations at all different sizes, right? Like they start to align with these frameworks. And let's say you're a startup, maybe you're having your admin assistant kind of like start going down this road for you, or you're making your first security hire because you have no knowledge of how these things work, but right, you're kind of really struggling and you need to align with these frameworks. I'm curious, just when do you think, is there a time, is it growth, is it revenue, when an organization kind of starts taking security a little more serious, building out a team, maybe bringing some consultants in, maybe considering some security software? Is there anything that you typically see or as a common denominator for that?
Yeah, I think from my perspective and focusing on startups, so my background, I probably should have mentioned as part of an introduction, as well as I work with a lot of startups. So when it starts to become a sort of objective, it's a barrier to growth if you don't have the fundamentals in place from an information security governance. It doesn't necessarily talk about headcount in terms of revenue or sales, but it's more around, okay, I'm going to go into business. I obviously want to try and build that trust, that reputation in the marketplace. My brand is very important. I need to make sure that I've got the actual information security governance in place to corroborate our reputation and how we're actually going to make sure that we're compliant against an internationally recognized standard. So I would say, given the importance in the modern day in terms of all the various different threats and vulnerabilities that exist out there and the implications that can be from having any sort of material weaknesses from a security governance, I would say from day one, if people are conscious that they need to be compliant against the security framework or have an appetite, if they haven't got the actual expertise in-house, they should look to either recruit or they should have an external information security partner who can assist them in that journey to understanding, okay, where are we at from day one? What's the maturity timelines in terms of preparation, in terms of what resources do we need to have in place? fundamentally understanding the landscape that you're operating in, not just the actual service line or industry, but understanding what assets are under your management and what's the prized possessions. I've mentioned on the previous question in terms of intellectual property, that's your sort of, you know, unique selling point, that's your intellectual data that you've built up. You want to make sure that's appropriately locked down and not going to be sort of, you know, a competitive threat to other people that would try and sort of have malicious intentions to use that data. But similarly, in terms of contractual obligations, how are you compliant against various frameworks? We talk about GDPR considerations, privacy as well. We need to make sure that, you know, if you're looking after client data and sensitive data, how are you compliant to make sure that you've got the actual preventative controls in place and detective controls to make sure that the data is locked down securely within your own environment and network? So I think from my perspective, it's not necessarily the profile of the organization. It's, you know, what are their objectives and do they have an understanding of what the implications are by not having a security governance framework in place. So I think from day one, there should be that understanding and there should be the expertise to support that.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Stas, what are your kind of thoughts around just the general idea of as an organization's maturing, adopting certain frameworks? Are there any frameworks that kind of come to mind to you? I know it's kind of a tough question because, you know, industry regions are going to play into this. But for instance, like a SOC 2, right? That's something that's not mandatory, more of something an organization is going to pursue to kind of maybe get a better feel of their security posture. Maybe they're doing it to prove assurances to their vendors, trying to close some further deals. Is a SOC 2, you know, do you think, is it enough? Is it enough for an organization, Stas, or is it just kind of scratching the surface?
It depends, right? I mean, like I said before, it is subjective and it is, you know, it is open to a lot more interpretation in terms of something like NIST CSF, which is a lot more stringent. And even the NIST CSF is a very good, is really good to be used as potentially a gap assessment. It's very clear in terms of what the requirements are. It's very clear in terms of maturity scoring. And it just gives organizations a good, you know, a good indication of where they are at a certain period of time and something to work off of and something to track over a period of time. I think there is something to be said, like security has to be included in an organization right from the get-go, like anything else, like HR, you know, you wouldn't set up a new company without having, you know, payroll and HR set up or having your accounting set up or a way to pay your taxes and things like that. So like, why would security be any different? The only difference between you know, the SOC 2 perspective of all of this is when getting an accreditation. Like, I completely agree that you need a governance framework and you need like an information security management system, full stop. It's just like when the company is actually mature enough and has a product that's mature enough to go to market, that's when they should probably consider actually getting someone to go over it as a third party and review it and make sure that it's okay. Like what I've been recently seeing is companies are getting accreditations for half-finished products or products that are still in development or that they're completely retooling. And I've heard a lot of people say that this is the proper way to go. It's just like, if you're assuring somebody that you have a SOC 2 for an unfinished product or product that's still in design, like that doesn't really hold a lot of water. And I don't, like, in my opinion. So I fully agree that you know, you need a management governance process right from the beginning. When you actually get someone to actually come in and take a look at it and say that, you know, stamp of approval to say that it's good to go for clients is, you know, is debatable for me. But that's my take on it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Stas. And the benefits of the SOC 2 report, you know, it's a snapshot of the business at a point in time. It goes through all the various different domains. If we look at common criteria for security, there's 9 different domains, and that impacts organization controls, risk assessments, internal audit, logical and physical access, software development lifecycle as well. Has to be in production, because if you look at a SOC 2 report, that's an attestation opinion, which talks about something that's actually live in a business as usual capacity. So from my perspective, what I've seen and what I do for a lot of clients is it helps build that trust, you know, give them that independent assurance. But as Stas mentioned, where they come in terms of the maturity, if you've only got potentially, you know, a small client base, maybe it's not necessarily beneficial to jump straight into the SOC 2. You might just want to potentially have that framework in place. And then what you'll see continually as part of the RFP process or part of a sort of contractual obligation is that they need an annual independence certification against an established standard such as SOC 2. We do see ISO 27001, but that's, you know, it's subject to the interpretation of the value, intrinsic value related to the accreditation. Certain sort of clients have to provide evidence of the ISO 27001 certification. Some have to provide evidence of the SOC 2. What we're seeing at the moment is a combination of both, actually. There's a lot of sort of demand in the marketplace for SOC 2 accreditation plus ISO 27001, just because it gives you that granular detail of the processes in place. Won't go into too much in terms of the description of system, the controls, but you can see it's a very sort of comprehensive exercise as it relates to information security governance, and having that independent sense check. And, you know, you can go through the various different iterations, readiness assessment, what we call a type 1 assessment, where you look at the design alone, and then what you go into an annual recertification, where you look at the actual operation of those controls. It could be 6, 9, 12 months as well. So yeah, that's what we typically see from that standpoint.
For sure. And just to piggyback off of that, like my experience with this has also been that organizations, although they might prefer a SOC, SOC 1 or SOC 2 type 2, there are often mitigating circumstances that they can use a questionnaire, like something like a SIG or an ATIC questionnaire, to mitigate those as well. So it's not, it's not the be all and end all if you don't have one, but there are other ways around it. And oftentimes, depending on the quality of the SOC 2 or mostly the SOC 2, because the ISO is pretty prescriptive, but there are oftentimes where there's follow-up questions, even if you do have a SOC 2 type 2, depending on the quality of the report and the quality of the auditor, there are oftentimes additional follow-up questions.
Yeah. Big fan of SOC 2, Stas, as you say. And probably one of the benefits, sorry, apologies, you touched up on it then, Stas, in terms of vendor questionnaires. The beauty of a SOC 2, for example, is it's a standardized report which satisfies a broad range of users. So it can be an integrated audit at one point in time to address all the various different considerations or security related questionnaires from your client base. So you can give them the SOC 2 to address those vendor security questionnaires, as opposed to obviously just giving it to your existing client base because it's a contractual obligation. You can give it prospectively as well to those customers, but it's a principle-based methodology, so it's not necessarily rigid. And what we see with some sort of frameworks, I won't mention any particularly, but it can be applied to various different instances and industries based on what your risk appetite is and what you consider a risk-centric focus from an audit standpoint. So it gives you these points of focus as opposed to a dogmatic binary pass or fail situation, which is what we've seen previously in older iterations of international framework standards.
Very cool. I'm curious, and John, I'll start with you. The explosion of the audit preparation software solutions that we've seen over the last couple of years. Some are great, some are not great, some do a good job, some are a checkbox. Just curious, from the integrity angle of it, do you think that's, do you think there's a space for that? Are organizations maybe, my perspective sometimes is that organizations are led a little astray thinking, they're going to rush over the line for a SOC 2, let's say, they get that rubber stamp, they think they're secure. They don't really have anyone maybe in the organization that understands the risk of thinking you're secure when you truly don't have security. But anyway, just wanted to know what you thought about them.
It's a really good question. Sometimes when you talk around getting accredited, achieving compliance with an international standard such as SOC 2 report and have a SOC 2 report in place, it's most important to actually make sure that, from my perspective, the due diligence. So, what I have seen in the marketplace is potentially people submitting data using potentially a cookie cutter approach, where they give you a sort of defined sort of output based on the information provided. But as I mentioned, in terms of the SOC 2, what I've seen typically and what worked best is having that sort of collaborative exercise, understanding the organization, the actual end-to-end processes, which you don't get necessarily from just submitting a bunch of data and requests to fit your profile, without having those detailed discussions, understanding the intricacies of the operations in place, and making sure that your control descriptions reflect the current day environment. So, typically when I speak to customers that are looking to embark on the SOC 2 journey, I'm interested in their policies and procedures, but I'm also interested in what they do on a day-to-day basis, how the process owners actually execute their controls, and what their little sort of quirks and caveats are and exceptions. Because ultimately, when you look at control appetite and description and how that's been executed on a daily basis, there will be those various different sort of touch points and dependencies that aren't necessarily fully manifested when you submit your data to a platform that would generate an output based on what the actual expected outcome would be. So yeah, I think from my perspective, I haven't necessarily had too much interaction with those approaches, purely because you need to really have a thorough understanding of the organization, understanding of the various different departments, not just IT, but looking at the sort of C-suite, looking at the sort of HR, sales, operations, any sort of overlap in terms of the responsibilities and who takes ultimate accountability. So it's a lot more sort of pervasive than just submitting the data from that perspective. And if we look at the sort of the current landscape, as we mentioned, organizations of a lot bigger magnitude than sort of startups, as we mentioned, have been compromised recently. If we look at Log4j, the vulnerability that impacted, from my perspective, a whole range of what we would call quite mature organizations. It impacted Homeland Security, State Commerce and Treasury, for example. It impacted a lot of clients that already had well-established security frameworks. They had preventative sort of security incident events monitoring logged in as well, and they were still able to penetrate and expose certain vulnerabilities in organizations' networks. So, from that perspective, irrespective of the maturity landscape, there's that continuous improvement, which I'm not sure you would get from submitting it just onto a platform that would generate predefined criteria.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think organizations hopefully, and I think generally do want to get to that space of like that continuous compliance, right? Where they're kind of just turning over day, week over week, month over month, versus kind of just like the snapshot, because the snapshot in time, right? Like that allows for, risk in the in-between, right? When you didn't prepare for that kind of audit period. Stas, what do you think? I'm sure it's pretty broad, but what do you think are the kind of risks associated with just kind of an organization relying on preparing for audits and not truly adopting that continuous compliance kind of philosophy?
I mean, this happens all the time, right? I mean, the vast majority, I can't say the vast majority, but a good portion of companies, right? I mean, this is what they do, right? Audit's done, they drop everything, go back to back to what they were working on, and then audit time comes around and they're all scrambling to get all the information together and trying to find evidence of them doing what they said they were going to be doing throughout the year. And this is pretty commonplace still. I mean, the vast majority of companies that are looking to implement continuous compliance is that they're looking to actually have some cost savings and time spending, some time back in terms of how much time they spend at the end of the year or at the beginning of the year putting all this data together. But it is it is something that should be kept up, and it is something that continuously needs to be running and looked at and reviewed. But it has to be done in a way that it's practical for people to review it easily and digest the data and to stay on top of things. There has to be something beneficial that comes out of continuous compliance. If it's just tedious reporting and the process is really manual or is really difficult to do, it's obviously going to fall behind. That's why it has to be repeatable and automated in order for it to work.
Yeah, just building on Stas's point there as well, it can't be sort of checklist driven purely. It's not a one size fits all approach. It needs to be strategically aligned to the objectives of the organization. Yeah, exactly. So, and what I've seen from Stas's sort of input as well for organizations, it's that continuous improvement, but it's also exception reporting. You have that baseline in place from a security governance standpoint, where you actually get to that level of maturity where you're just looking at the exceptions and actually focusing the attention on, okay, what are the key risks? Because we've actually covered to a large degree our sort of general sort of accepted risks at threshold appetite, and you're having those sort of, it enriches the discussions with management and buy-in from all the stakeholders, notably the CTO, CIO, COO, or the C-suite. They need to understand, okay, what are the threats and vulnerabilities impacting us currently, and having that sort of exception monitoring and that's underlying baseline, where if any deviations from that baseline are in place, then that's going to enhance the overall appreciation of why you have an information security position and a compliance platform that is focused purely on enriching the level of conversation and also addressing the most critical threats and vulnerabilities to the organization.
Yeah. Absolutely. And like if there is tooling, right, the tooling should be seen as an enhancement to your existing processes, right? It shouldn't be the be all and end all. and it should be flexible enough to be adaptable to new customer environments. Like literally had a customer this morning where we got a flag this morning, which threw me off, and it was instantly raised, and then I showed it to them, and they were just like, "Oh yeah, that's normal. That we just set up a new customer, and that for that one particular customer, we're allowed to do that. But if it happens on any other customer environments, it is going to be a big problem for us." But it's these type of things that happen all the time, right? Especially in like the fast moving, ever changing world of cloud-based technology and SaaS solutions, right? Things change all the time. So you need solutions that are configurable and adaptable to customer environments, but quickly, and in a continuous compliance methodology.
Yeah, precisely. And as you said, Stas, it's making sure you've got the scoping right in terms of, where does the infrastructure reside? This might be a misperception by some people saying, well, I've got my data residing in an S3 repository in AWS. Yeah. But that's, a hosted sort of platform. It doesn't necessarily look at the security configurations, doesn't look at actually who has access to my data. How is that locked down based on the provision of services from AWS, for example? It could be from Microsoft Azure. How are we making sure that the access to that data is appropriately restricted and it's compliant with our contractual obligations? And it might be a regulatory obligation as well, if you look at the various different jurisdictions that you operate in. So it's making sure that you have, the risk is that you're not scoping in all these sort of assets under your operations that are exposing you from a regulatory or contractual obligation, to make sure you're handling data in alignment with those contractual clauses that you've signed up to. In terms of any other additional risks when preparing for a security audit as well, I think, as we mentioned, you've got the sort of proprietary sort of platform that you can use, that continuous monitoring, but making sure that there's the appropriate resource allocation. We talked about C-suite, we talked about maybe information security managers, but there needs to be appropriate experienced, if that's in-house or it's outsourced. They need to be well versed in what the obligations are. If I look at one example in terms of, okay, from our infrastructure, we have a patch, but you have a patch based on vendor releases, right? This is what they said we should do as part of best practice or ad hoc basis. But are you patching the ones that are related to actually there was a vulnerability scan and it threw up a whole bunch of exceptions? Are you looking at that? That might not necessarily be something which you can be told or that you can rely on the vendor to give that time information. So if we look at Warcry, that impacts the whole range of customers. A couple of years ago, there was several sort of public agencies that were held at ransom to their data. We had hospitals that couldn't access their patient records because of being compromised for having legacy infrastructure in place. They didn't have the vulnerability functionality or function technology in place to really sort of make sure that they were compliant and had the latest versions installed. So it's making sure you have the resource allocation, the scope right, but also that continuous platform to make sure you're looking at the exceptions as and when they occur. So
I think there literally was just an incident this morning where a hospital literally went back to pen and paper because all their systems are down. Like literally, this happened like an hour ago.
In Brooklyn. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I was just looking for that because that popped up on just before we jumped on this call. That popped up on my radar. So interesting that you mentioned that.
yeah. Honestly, it's very topical, but it's one of those ones where, and as you said, in terms of the appetite for risk management and then information security governance, often more than not, it's a case of when you're going to be compromised, not if.
Assume breach, right? And it's now assume breach, right? And now mitigate.
Yeah, exactly.
John, I'm curious before we wrap up. 2022 is wrapping up here. We're almost halfway through the month. Going to switch over right into the new year. Anything from this past year, consistencies you've seen from a compliance standpoint that you think maybe an organization needs to consider as they move into 2023? Anything front of mind?
I think from my perspective, there is a couple sort of themes, and I've sort of touched on one or two before, but if you look at this sort of linkages in terms of the third-party dependencies, the traditional data center is not as popular these days, depending on the organization. It's understanding, okay, what's the actual profile in terms of, okay, my data, my customer's data is potentially hosted in a third-party cloud provider, for example. how am I making sure that I'm compliant against not just my contractual obligations, but the obligations from the actual cloud provider itself? There's sometimes a disconnect in terms of where the boundaries of responsibility lie based on your relationship with that cloud infrastructure provider. So I would like to see, and what we do see from this year going to next, is as people make that digital transformation, economies of scale, go into the cloud hosting environment, they want to make sure that actually, am I actually compliant with what the cloud hosted provider is, not just with my obligations to the customer. It's understanding, okay, how am I looking at those SOC 1, SOC 2 reports from AWS, from Microsoft Azure, from Google Cloud, for example? How am I tightening and defining the security standards that are compliant with their expectations as well, and handling the data? And also what I see at the moment is, information security governance. We've talked a lot about technologies in terms of, the stack that you have in place, patching requirements against threats and vulnerabilities, but a greater appreciation from information security governance. So we see a lot from phishing attempts, hacking attempts in terms of people's actual desktops. We can rely on endpoint protection and encryption of data, but making sure that actually are my staff actually aware of what their obligations are? Can they actually determine what's a genuine email or what's a phishing attempt for a malicious agent to actually compromise the network? We see that continually as well. So that's something which, we do see people having not just the annual information security awareness, but continuous monitoring and continuous testing of people's thresholds for those risks coming through emails on a daily basis. So there's sort of a couple sort of key themes. And also in terms of, lastly, from my perspective, is information security isn't going away. If anything, it's going to be a top agenda. Cybersecurity is one of the sort of top agendas at the C-suite level. It's not just pervasive from a contractual obligation, but if you look at sort of traditional financial statement accounting, it's okay, what's the brand reputational image? What's the risk not having a up-to-date information security governance model in place and a continuous improvement? If you look, for example, from not just the risk of loss of IP, but it's also, the cost associated to a cybersecurity hack and the time to remediate it. There could be service credits, there could be potential lawsuits, there could be fines from regulatory agencies. If we look at GDPR, for example, still under the EU's Data Protection Act, companies can potentially face fines of up to 20 million or potentially 4% of the worldwide turnover, whichever is higher. So there's that sort of real existent sort of legislation in place. And associated to that, there could be higher insurance premiums. If you have had a hack and it's been publicly made aware that you haven't got this sort of security governance in place, and then potentially loss of productivity from your staff who are actually having to deal with firefighting on a daily basis with the information security governance, the cybersecurity remediation, and ultimately that feeds into the brand reputational damage risks inherently there as well. So I think it's just having that sort of people, process, technology, and understanding that the landscape is evolving. There's a lot more sort of sophisticated attacks every day, and how do you lock that down? How do you identify it? How do you isolate it and go through your sort of information security sort of framework to address that?
Yeah, wow, that's a lot of insight.
Yeah, that's very comprehensive.
Yeah, Stas, anything John left off his list?
No, I think John pretty much covered all the entire list. No, I mean, it's more or less going to be the same, right? I mean, like all the breaches that we're seeing, right? I mean, apart from a few state-sponsored, hacking attempts or like APTs, advanced persistent threats, like the majority of the stuff is all coming back to fundamentals, right? It's like not having fundamentals in place, in terms of not having fundamental policies or standards in place, and therefore people not following processes. So when they're spinning up new machines, they're leaving their S3 buckets unblocked or open to the public, and there's no monitoring on top of that. Like we're talking about not doing proper vendor due diligence. We're talking about like not having a proper risk management program because it's boring and nobody wants to do it, but yet it's super valuable once you actually get going. Like it's been a broken record. I mean, the industry has moved on quite a bit in the past 5 years, but a lot of the stuff is still very much a broken record of just people not being able to implement or maintain fundamentals in an organization, because it's not a one and done in this industry. It's you have to water and nurture it and take care of it, and that's we have tools to help with that, but someone has to still do it.
Yeah, completely agree, Stas. I think it's getting back to the grassroots, irrespective of how we evolve and the technology stacks that are deployed from an information security governance. It's the traditional risk and controls. They don't fundamentally change. They're just they're you know they're presented in different sort of facets on a continuous basis. So I completely, it's music to my ears in terms of hearing that as well, Stas.
Awesome.
There you go.
Great.
Well, John, Stas, thank you both for diving into this kind of chat here. Really insightful. A lot of great kind of information covered here. I appreciate it, and I'm sure the viewers will as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, guys.